Now, before I get into talking about the actual Sonic World R6, I wanted to take some time to do something a little different. See, while the core elements that make up Sonic World might seem pretty obvious now, looking from the outside, in the year time span between R1 and R5, the idea of what Sonic World would be was a bit of a fluid concept. As a result, there's a giant treasure trove full of lost and unreleased content that for the most part wasn't officially abandoned until the team really had the chance to sit with the game during the R6 development cycle. Of all the cut content, the most notable thing was the story mode promised in R2. Now, while these plans changed and evolved all the way through until R6, the general plan and gist remained the same. The story mode would contain a series of original levels, modeled by Nibrock, and each team would go through a series of them until fighting another team, and then eventually fighting a final boss. Of course, all of this is easier said than done, especially with so few team members. And while perhaps this task would have been fairly obtainable with the right amount of planning and willpower, when looking at the plan, it is immediately clear that these are not things the team possessed in this instance.
I was in charge of essentially designing what was an ever-changing base concept from the original creator, and yeah, initially it started with like 5 teams, but then more characters were added, so then it had to be 6 teams. And I think by the end the concept was to have 8 teams, but some of the teams were teams of 2, and some of the teams were teams of 3, which very much messed with the flow of like the system. And it was also meant to have like bosses and repeat stages, and we had a design document. The infamous Eggman forklift being certified comes from that concept of a list of boss ideas I had, one of them being Eggman forklift, which was just a random like concept of just Eggman plus some random object.
Syph and Oz went wild with ideas, until at one point there were as many as 34 new original stage ideas floating around, and even a chart that mentioned the number 36 for this game. Regardless, the number of original stages was, in my opinion, absurd, even for a couple of people to do. There were also even mentions of 4 unique bosses, named the Egg Kraken, Egg Mosquito, Egg Slasher, and Egg Pimp, respectively. Once push came to shove, though, only a small fraction of these realistically went anywhere. All of the following stages were planned and developed for R4, but scrapped since they weren't ready. These would later be tabled over to R6 story mode plans, but as mentioned before, these two would ultimately not work out. First up was Blossom Paradise. The level can best be described as an action stage that combined the idea of a grass and beach theme, with some ethereal surroundings for good measure. In the end, though, the level would remain only as an unobjected 3D mesh. Glacial Clamber. Glacial Clamber was a small treasure hunt arena with a mix of a beach and ice theme. Like the last two, art depicting the stage's proposed layout was created, and the stage ended up being fully modeled and objected, but was ultimately cut for unknown reasons. However, it was likely due to just being generally underwhelming. The music, meant as the BGM for Glacial Clamber, was Marlon Saunders' The Beginning of Never, which can be found in the files of early pre-release builds of R4, lending to the theory that this was at one point set to make it in. Also, on an only somewhat related note, there's another mysterious song in said build labeled Disco. What level or theme this song was meant for is still unknown to this day. Perhaps one of the alternate themes for Tokyo Street. OG Chao Garden. There were also plans for there to be a Chao Garden the player could visit in between stages of story mode. Much like the others, concept art was drawn up of the original modeling plan for the stage. Some additional scrapped ideas for this Chao Garden include changing the pets in the garden from Chao to Wisps, and the ability to customize your Chao, with attributes taken from Nintendo's Mii's. Other levels mentioned in the story mode documents that were sketched out include Hidden Wasteland, Murky Basil, Fantasy Slide, and Ozone Summit, all of which never made it to modeling. Funnily enough, Tokyo Street was also mentioned in one of the documents, and is likely one of the only stages planned as a concept for story mode that not only was finished, but made it into the game. Although that's pretty much everything in terms of information on story mode. there were still a good number of Nibrock stages that, for whatever reason, were made but never put into the final version of R4. Rocky Mountain. Rocky Mountain was a proposed R4 stage that got as far as being shown off in the R4 trailer. The level consisted of the player traversing a mountainside town full of bridges and cliffs and moving through a series of caves and volcanoes. Eventually, the player would reach a teleporter and have to go through a teleporter maze, which would have put the new gimmick on display. The stage was scrapped despite being fully modeled and objected. The reason is unknown, but the teleporter maze was admittedly very tedious, so that may have played into it. Original Love Garden. Although Love Garden appeared in R3, it was originally supposed to be much different. So was Tokyo Street. See, initially, Nibrock imagined a stage which combined both, as well as a third potential stage based on Sonic Lost World's Honeycomb Highway. Ultimately, however, the bigger version of this level was deleted and is currently lost, all that existing being this video. Fun-O Test. Much like Rocky Mountain, Fun-O Test made a brief appearance in the R4 trailer. Unlike the other stages, however, I doubt this one was ever planned to actually make it into R4. See, Fun-O Test was nothing more than a test stage made by Nibrock to quickly come to grips and get accustomed to stage modeling. Now, as a result, you'd expect the level to be more of an open area like the Arrows mod one, but in actuality, Fun-O Test is mostly a series of linear speed segments with the occasional open area. Frost Peak 2015. Created with the intent to be released with R6, Frost Peak was created at the tail end of the story mode plans. The stage had the player traversing down a snowy hill before climbing a big tower. Think Ice Cap from Sonic Adventure 1 meets Crystal Frost from Sonic Extreme. Besides all of this, another notable fact is that early back in the R4 days, Ozcrash had already made plans for what his next game would be following Sonic World's completion. This game, while technically unnamed, was said to be related to Crash Bandicoot. Evidence of this can be seen in many of Sonic World's gimmicks, with things like dynamite crates. Worst Cave and Fun-O Test also contained Crash music. For those in the know, a Crash follow-up made by Oz indeed never came to fruition, or at least hasn't yet. Overall, while there was definitely a lot of really cool and interesting ideas that never came to fruition, they ultimately helped inform what would come next. And with that in mind, it's hard to be too disappointed in what we eventually got with Sonic World R6.